Hi, everyone. Welcome. We are going to get started in just 1 minute. We're just going to wait for people to come in from the waiting room, and then we'll get underway. Thanks so much for joining us. Anybody who's here right off the bat, you're the early birds. You're the keeners. So we're just going to wait for those laggards to trickle in from the waiting room. We'll get started in just 1 minute. Thank you. Okay, why don't we get underway? Thanks so much for joining us. Bonjour tout le monde. My name is Rick Smith. It's my great privilege to be the president of the Canadian Climate Institute, and I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And I want to welcome you to this Ask Me Anything session with our hardworking staff on the topic of our recent release of the 2024 early estimate of national emissions. So some of you may know where this project came from. This is the fourth year in a row that our institute, through using a different methodology, has released 7 months ahead of the release of the official national inventory of emissions for our country. We've calculated this early estimate of national emissions, and for the past few years, this early estimate's been quite accurate in terms of the eventual official Government of Canada numbers. This now annual project is just one way that our institute is trying to make good on our mission of ensuring momentum and continuity in the climate change discussion in Canada, and to always make sure that climate change policy, climate change ideas are rooted in the best available evidence and analysis. We just think that the challenges of climate change, the opportunities of climate change, deserve the best possible analysis. I think it's fair to say that this is a critical moment for climate policy, for climate progress, not just in Canada, but around the world. And I know I speak on behalf of all of our hardworking staff when I say that we will be doing everything we can to ensure that discussion proceeds in a positive and a solutions focused manner. And so this early estimate of national emissions is just one of the many contributions you should watch for from our institute in our areas of focus this autumn. And of course, we work not just in the mitigation area, but also in adaptation, clean growth, sustainable finance, and Indigenous research. So thank you again for joining us. I'm not going to belabor how Zoom webinars work. But what's going to happen here is we're going to have about a 15-minute presentation, a short deck, sort of running down our early estimate findings. You can, at any time, ask questions through the Q&A function of Zoom, and we'll have a more free-flowing discussion, getting to your questions after the presentation. So I want to turn it over now to my colleagues, Dave Sawyer, our institute's principal economist, and Seton Stiebert, a fantastic consultant to our 440 Megatonnes project. They're going to take it away in terms of the presentation. Over to you guys.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. So it takes a village to do climate policy, and I wanted to thank our hardworking team, our comms team, our communication engagement people, editors, and of course Seton doing a lot of hard work. We'll just put the deck up in a second, and there it comes, and I'll jump in. So the genesis of the project really starts with a conversation with Nick Rivers literally 5 years ago, and we were bemoaning the fact that we really didn't have a good indicator of where we were in progress. so that we could understand how past policies were working, how market trends were driving stuff forward, and how perhaps emissions might be tracking. And so we sort of determined that, you know what, there's likely enough Stats Canada data there and other data we can cobble together to get out an early estimate of national emissions. And so this is our first early estimate, our fourth early estimate. Yeah, we'll just jump right into it. So next slide, please. So why the early estimate? I think we're all aware, we're all in climate policy, that the national inventory report, as I said, lags significantly. It's sort of understandable. ECCC has to follow strict methodological guidelines. They have quality assurance processes they have to follow. There's the IPCC methodologies that have to be followed, and there's updates to those. And then, of course, there's a federal, provincial, and territorial review process, because as we know, these emission estimates and certainly the national inventory and the projections are all highly political, given commitments governments have made. So it takes time. That said, we thought there was a gap, and we filled it with the ENE. There was progress last year with ECCC putting out an early estimate as well, a progress report, preliminary GHG estimates released in late 2024. And so, we think that's a good thing, and we hope we've sort of helped catalyze that process so we all get a better estimate. Because of course, the NIR is the official estimate of, accounting of our actual emissions, and so that's really what matters. And we're just giving a preliminary sort of view of what's going on. 440, as you all probably know, we're data driven, so we care about using data to inform policy. And we really, our motivation here is to inform progress on emission reductions and basically help with course correction. So, complementary to this, we do a lot of work on teasing out trends, looking at indicators of progress, EV sales, heat pump deployment, biofuel penetration, these sorts of indicators. So we're sort of working across a bunch of dimensions. So next slide, please, Ross. So what did we find? Hopefully you've all seen our insight. And so once we tumbled the numbers, and Seton did a lot of the hard work, he's going to jump in here in a second to give us a more detailed overview of the methods he followed, and how to think about the process. And then we'll open it up to Q&A for more discussion. So progress has stalled and is fragile. And we say this for two reasons with flatlined emissions at basically last year's estimates. The official number may be up a bit, down a bit, but we're basically flat. So the fragility really rests on two premises. One, momentum is going the wrong way. So major indicators of the trajectory of emissions, particularly oil sands, no new story here, but it's a continuing story. The trajectory of these emissions are accelerating basically. And so when we look at the data, we see these emissions are rising faster in time. And so that's putting upward pressure on emissions. And then the reductions in the other sectors aren't quite as large as they have been in the past to offset a bunch of that growth from oil sands primarily, and a bit from conventional oil and gas as well. And when you look at these two together, these two sort of bundles together, you see the emission intensity, the economy is not decoupling as fast as it has in the past. So what does that mean? It basically means in the past, the economy could grow and emissions would fall and the intensity would, fall and offset some of the growth. And now that we see a narrowing of this emission intensity and basically off of historical levels, as the economy grows, we get sort of more emissions per unit of growth. And so, yes, the emission intensity of the economy is down, but that rate isn't as large as it was. So the decoupling story isn't as strong. So that's the first bit. We look into the past. And then, of course, when we look into the future and we think about projections, we basically have been doing a bunch of modeling, and we put out a new report last week, a new insight on federal provincial contributions to emission reductions. Equivalency matters. Equivalent and overlapping policy is doing most of the heavy lifting in the country. And when we do that modeling, we see we're on track for about 20 to 25% below 2030, primarily because a lot of the backsliding that's gone on. So there's all kinds of federal and provincial policies that have slowed or been repealed, the federal carbon tax, and the watering down of the provincial large emitter trading systems, industrial carbon pricing are just two big examples. And then, of course, with the LNG production already slated, LNG Canada phase one, and then wood fiber, cedar, et cetera, big, large increases in emissions, basically driving our emissions in the wrong direction. So this led us to our conclusion about fragility, basically. So next slide, please, Ross. So we're calling 2025 is the fork in the road, not a fork in the road. It's an important sort of place to stop and take stock. And we really see FPT coordination can restore momentum, sort of picking up on the latest maybe détente somewhat between the feds and the provinces and the territories. And so how do we think about where we are with the targets? So first, a reminder, every ton matters, right? Emission reductions are not a pass-fail test. Every ton avoided into the atmosphere avoids a drag on global damages and avoids a drag on Canadian damages, whether they're health damages, ecosystem damages, or economic damages. We've done a lot of work on the economic drag in the country, the cost of climate change, and it's quite large. So every ton matters. There's this opportunity right now to restore momentum. So the piece we put out last week really looks at, concludes that shared responsibility and shared powers leads to sturdy climate policy, and often durable climate policy when there's overlapping policies that basically act as backstops, like coal ban regulations and carbon pricing programs addressing coal, say in Alberta. And so that's led to action in the past that we see real reductions from. And then, of course, federal minimum standards really matter, and FPT coordination can shift the momentum there. And the two working together, sort of provincial, territorial, unique policy backstopped by federal standards, minimum standards, is really what's underpinned success in the past. And so that ends up, we end up basically concluding, the feds, the provinces, the territories really have to make some choices in the short term to get momentum back, and basically hold on to the progress we've had and then push forward for more. So that's it for me in this front end, and now we'll jump into methodology with Seton and then hop into questions.
Great. Thank you, Dave. I'll talk briefly about methodology and then a little bit about the results as well. So our early estimates look like the published tables in the National Inventory Report. So we have tables there for both the economic sector as well as the IPCC sources and sinks of emissions. Our methodology we've developed, it gives us an early signal of the next year's emissions using available data that we are able to collect. But we have to understand that's not the same as this sort of bottom-up built national inventory that Environment Canada is doing. So our relevant 2024 activity data that we're collecting, it's different. We may not have publicly available information. That data might not yet be published, or we simply have different or more detailed methodologies in compared to the National Inventory Report. Just a reminder that the ENI is also not a forward-looking projection. So we're actually not looking how different policies evolved in 2024 that might have changed the rate of decarbonization in different sectors that we consider. Next slide, please. So the ENI is driven by the data we collect. This data is mostly from StatsCan, but we are also getting some data from the Industrial Energy and Emissions Database of the Canadian Energy and Emissions Data Center. We try as much as possible to choose activity data that is most closely correlated to a specific emission category. So in that case, we generally prefer physical production data like tons of steel or tons of cement over economic data like GDP or demographic information. Next slide, please. So here in front of us, we have an example of the estimates that are on the 440 website. This is the table for by economic sector category. So all of the historical data in this table from 2005 to 2023 is exactly like the National Inventory Report. And the only thing we are estimating here is the 2024 year column, the green column, which is our early estimate. The website, if you go there, you can flip from economic sector to look at also by IPCC category. Next slide, please. So this figure is showing the historic emissions again. And it also shows our 2024 early estimate. And it also shows the 40% below 2005 target or milestone for 2030. We should note here that the 2030 target includes contributions from the LULUCF sector. So there's a bit of a relative difference there because our national inventory emissions there are just do not include the LULUCF sector. What the figure is illustrating is that even though we've seen some downward progress over the years, we just don't see or it doesn't exhibit reductions to date that are nearly enough to reach our targets. We're not bending that curve down further and further. And we've also had, at the same time, recently, there's been rollback in the stringency of carbon policies across the country. So this brings up the question, what can we expect? Are we going to see more flat or even potentially rising emissions unless existing policies become more stringent and new policies are rolled out? Next slide, please. So if we look at the long-term changes in emissions between 2005 and 2024 by economic sector, we can see that there are varying levels of progress. So here we can see the emissions growth in oil sands with much greater production today has a growth in emissions. And also agricultural emissions are slightly rising in this chart. In contrast, we see nearly flat transportation emissions and decreasing emissions in the waste and other sectors like light manufacturing and coal production. We can see here for the electricity sector, we see significant reductions have occurred, and that has contributed to most of the total reductions in national emissions, not including LULUCF, that are down 64 megatons or nearly 9% from 2005. It's important to note that, in 2005, electricity emissions accounted for 16% of total national inventory emissions, and today they only account for 8%. So there is a question of how much more work can the electricity sector alone drive future emission reductions. Next slide, please. So this slide is now looking at the expected year-to-year change between 2023 reporting year and the 2024 early estimate. In this figure, we see oil and gas is overwhelmingly accounting for the increase in emissions for all sectors. We know this is driven by a surge to record levels of production in the oil and gas sector. It's not just the emission intensity, it's record levels of production. And we can also see here agriculture, transport sectors are relatively flat, unchanged. you can see that the transport sector, if we look at the activity information, there's a large increase in demand for travel, but it's flat because it's been offset by decarbonized fuels and efficient vehicles. For buildings, we see another decline in emissions this year. We did last year as well, but it is also now driven by another warm winter, one of the warmest on record, and therefore we have lower heating demand. So the contribution here of efficiency gains is small compared to just the fact that it was a warmer winter. And we had done some estimates that building emissions might have been 2 megatons higher this year if it had been an average winter season. For heavy industry overall, there's a small drop in annual emissions, reversing a small gain that we saw last year. But if we go in and we look at the individual sectors, which you can on our website, you can see that that progress is uneven across the different composite sectors. And finally, electricity emissions again had a small drop of a megaton. Overall, the contributions led to us expecting a very small change in total emissions. Here it's shown as 0.5 megatons. But relative to the uncertainty of all these projections, that's why we say that we are flat. We don't really know whether it's a small amount up or down. We'll jump to the next slide, and I'm going to pass it back to Dave.
Thank you, Seton. That's great. Last slide, and then we'll open it up. I'm going to have a couple questions for Seton to start off a bit of a dialogue, and then we'll jump into the questions. There's 7 or so questions now, five or so. Yeah, just maybe type some more in. We'll respond as we can. So Seton, get ready. I have some questions for you.
Perfect.
Coming at them cold. So what are we concluding, and how did we end up where we are in terms of our narrative, our messaging, taking stock of Canada's emission progress to date and likely what the future looks like, where we are today, basically. So, Canada's emissions flatlined in 2024. Bit of a surprise for us, but not a huge surprise given what we knew about economic activity and in particular record oil sands growth. So, we concluded that progress is really fragile and it's at risk, right? At risk is a key term here. So the Federation, and, we use that term purposefully because shared responsibility in the country for policies and programs, industrial carbon pricing being the big glaring one right now, where, provinces are playing games to water the effectiveness of the systems down. And we're going to have some more research coming out on that soon. And we've been talking about it, frankly, for the last 2 years. And so it's shared responsibility. So the Federation's emissions flatlined, and it's showing that hard-won effort across the board stalled and momentum is slipping. We've had almost 400 federal, provincial, and territory policies implemented since 2016, so the last decade. So it's been a frenetic pace, and there's a lot of policy there, and we've actually seen evidence that a lot of those policies are working. It's hard to often tease out exactly the contribution of a policy to emissions. There's a lot of noise in the system when you try and disentangle it, but generally we see that policy is biting, and there's enough there to know that we're reducing emissions and progress is there, but it's at risk. And then, of course, emissions are not a pass or fail test. Hitting the target is not a pass or fail test. I like to say it's targetitis. We have this disease around whether we're on track or not. And there's this tendency to say, oh, we're a total failure because we didn't hit it, or why should we do anything because we're a total failure? And we tend to think at the Institute, the answer lies somewhere in the middle, where every ton avoided reduces global damages and economic drag. So we are trying to reduce emissions to reduce those current and future damages that we've actually quantified and taken a look at. Of course, there's an opportunity right now to restore momentum. So our research, our forthcoming, which is now our recent research, shows coordination, FPT coordination delivers the biggest climate policy wins. If you go to the 440 Megatonnes website, you'll see our latest insight there. It's worth a read. We spent almost a year of analytics looking at federal, provincial, and territorial policies, what they've delivered, and then how they can be coordinated and work a little better together to deliver more emission reductions, given shared responsibility and shared jurisdiction for emission reductions. From that research, as I said, we really think federal minimum standards matter to keep everybody at a minimum level. And of course, some jurisdictions can stretch beyond that. And that's been the nature of the Federation in the past, leaders and laggards on climate policy. And then we think coordination across some proven tools in the short term really need attention. So conventional oil and gas methane rules should be updated and made more stringent. Industrial carbon pricing or large emitter trading systems really need a modernization. And with carbon prices, market prices trading at basically $20 a ton right now, and there's no transactions going on. There's sort of bids out there. Hey, we'll buy your tons for $20. That's below levels that we saw over a decade ago in the tier system, or at the time specified gas emitter regulations. So they need to clean up, and of course, cleaner vehicles and fuels. Lots of talk about the clean fuel regulation and the EV mandates. So these focus here is needed to get progress back on track, shared jurisdiction, shared responsibility. So we're calling this a fork in the road, and we're really, with the ENI trying to put a spotlight on the need for that coordination and more policy. So I will stop there, and I'm going to ask Seton a really quick question, then we'll go to all the other questions. And, Seton, you have been wallowing, my favorite term, wallowing in the data, 50, 60 data sets for a number of years now on this. What have you learned from it? What do you think we can pull out of these estimates and out of the national inventory? What's a big lesson here that sort of strikes you?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of information that we can get, right? One really important thing, and you've talked about momentum, right? The momentum of emission reductions. So what feeds into that? We can look at the different drivers with the data that we have. And so, is it driven by an increased use of energy? Is it being driven by changes in production, right? Physical unit production? Um, is there real progress in the actual emission intensity of emissions per unit of production or per unit of energy, right? So is it fuel switching that's helping us? And so we've done some analysis that we've published on our website where we look specifically at those drivers to say, here's where we see progress in transportation, for example. There's large improvements in emission intensity because we are driving more efficient vehicles. The fleet is getting much more efficient over time. And then we looked at electric vehicles. Well, yeah, it's helping, but it's still such a small portion of the fleet that it's not giving us great emission reductions yet, right? As that, the percentage of new vehicles per year that are electrics is increasing over time and will give us in the future something better. So it's good to see those trends in those short-term trends, right? To understand them.
Yeah, thanks, Seton. I mean, you remind me. So on the 440 website, we have something called the emission tracker, and in there we apply something called the Kaya identity, Kaya. And you go check that out because it's a really good mental model to think about how emission reductions or increases occur and the offsetting drivers. So just to sort of formalize what Seton said, and you can go look at the tracker, basically emissions are a function of economic activity. Are people driving more? Is there more barrels? Are there more barrels being produced? So that has typical upward pressure, more population, upward pressure on emissions, downward pressure typically, but sometimes upward is the energy efficiency in the economy. So energy per unit of economic output per kilometer driven. And then there's a decarbonization driver, which is basically emissions per unit of energy. And there's other factors in there as well. But basically emissions per unit of energy should be falling in time, and that can offset. And what you see when we break this out is you see energy efficiency in time has been really important to drive down emissions. It's not just the big kind of fun, sexy policies that we think about. It's actually just kind of like boring energy efficiency has been a really big driver, pull down of emissions in time. You can think about the vehicle efficiency standards, and you can think about appliance standards, and you can think of new equipment just becoming more efficient as it comes online. So anyway, that's one way to think about it. And yeah, and I think that's about it. We could maybe go to some questions here. Seton, actually, do you have another thought there? Did I sort of remind you of something to think about?
No, that's great. I'm looking at the first question, which is, do we have data estimates for provinces and territories, or is it just national level? And the answer is we have just been doing national level. There are various reasons for that. There is provincial activity data for some things, but we want to hit everything in a short time frame. We only have so many months before we really need the information. And a lot of data can be suppressed at the provincial level, which is another big challenge for us to understand how, if we need to know production units per province, sometimes we won't know for all provinces, and makes that work challenging. It's also yeah, it's just be a lot more work to do it by province. We don't intend to, but maybe we can think about adding that feature in the longer term.
Thanks, Seton. I was going to jump to oil sands is an easy one to address first while we think of the other one. So, Seton, what is driving oil sands emissions, production increases, or failing to make progress on emission intensity? I know we've just done the deep dive on this. We're going to put out an insight on 440 shortly about emission intensity for some key sectors. And what's going on, and that's an important driver. As there's more production, are you offsetting production with emission intensity improvements, and therefore driving down emissions? So what do you think, Seton, on emission intensity in oil sands in particular?
Yeah, so we see large drivers in production, but that the production increase isn't the same for all types of oil and gas products. And so we have, you think of the main products, we have natural gas, what's happening there. Where we've seen natural gas, we've seen large improvements in fugitive emission reductions, right? Which is contributing to lower emission intensity for that sector. For bitumen, it matters whether new production's in situ, uh, um, because different pathways have different emission intensities, and they're also declining at the emission intensity of production is declining at different rates. And we have seen in the oil sands that maybe, that decline has slowed. You know, Improvements have been made. As you dig into resources deeper, you have to, those resources might need more energy to extract. And so that's working against future declines of emission intensity. So we got all these interesting things happening, that we're showing here as a global average overall number for oil and gas, uh, um, the oil and gas sector.
Yeah, thanks, Seton. Yeah. And continuing on emission intensity, there's a question here about carbon or emission intensity. And sometimes the absolute emissions and the emission intensity mask some more structural changes in the economy or large events. So I know, for example, we can see in the emission data and the activity data, COVID, we can see the oil crash of 2015, we can see the recession of the financial crisis of 2019. We see this. Seton, what do you think? Oh, we got a whiteboard going on. Uh, that's okay. Seton, what do you think? What do you see in those events, and then how do we smooth them in the trends? And how does it? I mean, COVID maybe is a good example to look at the trends.
Yeah, we have to be careful of events like COVID, where, we saw an unexpected large drop in activity. And that drop in activity, it's not automatically, you don't see the same drop in emissions because there's an activity drop. Um, there's effects that they might not follow each other exactly. Um, I think, yeah, I I think there's a lot to learn, and which is why we talk about, our ENI sort of this momentum change so that we don't see drops in emission intensity per unit of production that we need to reach the target, right? And this is the concern. This is that's jumping out at us, and why we're sort of raising alarm about our need for attention there and a need for policy there.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, so with COVID, of course, we had a large contraction in economic activity in some areas, offset in others. So more people at home, but driving less. So more electricity, mostly decarbonized, driving less, mostly fossil fuel emissions associated with personal transport. And so we were really careful to look at trends coming out of COVID. But we do see often a reset in the emissions and the emission intensity and activity levels after an event like that. And we're always interested to see how fast those trends come back to sort of the pre-event level. And typically we've seen a reset there. It's interesting, and it speaks really well to behavior. When we looked at transportation emissions coming out of COVID, they actually were really sort of, there was a structural change there and a behavioral change. More people working at home, right? And so one of the things we talked about this year was the requirement of back to work is really starting to take hold now. So in a couple of years from now, in the inventory, we'll likely see a rise in emissions, and it depends what happens with offsetting intensity improvements, whether through fuel standards or EV penetration, hybrid penetration, that sort of thing. So yeah, we have to be a little careful when we're looking at it, but we're looking for sort of, okay, are we going back to level, and then what are the sort of main drivers of those levels? Yeah, that was really good. Thank you, Seton. I was going to jump in here to another one, change it up a little bit. There's a lot on oil and gas. There's a bit of existential stuff, but maybe I'll just ask a simple one right now. Removals, Seton. How are removals treated in the inventory? And maybe I can capture a couple of questions in this one. I mean, the inventory follows IPCC and UNFCCC rules on how emissions are accounted for within the country, and how, and and what we're responsible for, and then how do removals fit into that. There's sort of
Yeah.
two questions there, because there's one question about downstream consumption and attribution of those emissions to Canada,
Yeah, so
and so yeah.
there are two types of removals we're talking about, right? So, removals of, combustion or industrial process emissions are captured within the industry that it occurs, right? So if there's a removal from oil and gas emissions by carbon sequestration, that is accounted for specifically within the oil and gas sector. Removals related to land use, we have not captured in this analysis here. It's just something beyond the scope of this work.
Yeah, and how does the inventory treat it? So what are the rules around the UNFCCC rules? How are removals? Maybe you can talk about wildfires a little bit, because that's kind of interesting. And because I know you've done some work there in
Yeah.
carbon accounting for wood. And yeah, so let me chat about this a little bit and inform all of us.
Yeah, I mean it's a very complex field, and um, the inventory is accounting for removals from land use, and let's say it's 20 megatons in the books that we're counting on as a removal. Um, what's behind that number is a lot of detailed modeling information, and to be honest, some uncertainty. because it's a very difficult thing to measure, and we count on models and observations and data to estimate those removals. But essentially, you're saying that, for example, in this managed forest in Canada, we expect this amount of 10 megatons of CO2 to be sequestered within these forests, and therefore is a removal of 10 megatons overall. But it's uh, th there when we talk about wildfire, for example, it's off the books. It's not considered in the balance of the inventory because it's not considered as an anthropogenic activity. It's not unless it's on managed forest lands. So there is certainly a large uncertainty there, and a lot of questions have been asked about how those estimates are made and how valid they are in the overall scheme of things to tell us how we're doing, right? How we're doing relative. So if we're using them towards emission reduction targets, um, there's some question about their validity and our
Yeah,
balance.
there's a couple of things going on here, right? There's sort of the historical emissions in the NIR that are accounted for, and then there's the sort of, and those are gross emissions, and then there's the net emissions that are used to count towards Canada's target. And the net emissions could include some things like there's some LULUCF land use accounting credits that Canada gets for its forests. There's maybe some ITMO, some internationally traded mitigation outcome units like WCI, Western Climate Initiative credits imported by Quebec from California. There's these sort of, and then there's some land nature-based stuff that can be included. So those come off the gross emissions in a year, and we're not calculating that at all. But we do that certainly. We typically adopt the government's numbers when we look at our projections. So we model something into the future, and then we look at those accounting adjustments from gross emissions to account against Canada's progress to its target, and that's straight up UNFCCC, sanctioned approaches. And then on the land use question in Canada, one of the interesting things a few years ago in the NIR and the National Inventory Report was we saw a soil increase in soils. I remember that, Seton, where and primarily agricultural soils had been a sink for emissions. And now, with a really dry year and climate change, we saw an increase in emissions in the inventory, which was kind of different and a bit of a warning about climate change. So even in our emission inventory, we saw a climate change warning there. So I'll stop on that. And maybe I'll jump into another question. There was a question about oil and gas production. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but could you get rid of, I shouldn't say this, but how do you hit the target without reducing emissions from Canada's oil and gas sector? Seton, what do you think? Do we need emission reductions from oil and gas basically to hit the target? I think the answer is yes.
The answer is yes. It's grown. We look at the oil and gas emissions as a percentage of the total emission inventory. It's now at its peak highest level ever. It hit 31% of total national emissions, right? There's no getting around it. That has to be addressed. Emission intensity per unit of production has to fall dramatically, and we have to be very careful about, you know, further increases in production.
We've got a question about how emission estimates are used. There's a lot of, like how they're interpreted. What do they mean? I think we've learned, and I'll turn it over to you in a second, Seton, but our objective at 440 is to put out good data that others can use to make choices, right? And so how the data is used is really up to other folks because we see it used, for all kinds of purposes to prove points. And really, our objective is to get good data out and be recognized as a credible source of data that can form a common touchstone for folks to argue about what needs to be done, does or doesn't need to be done. And we found in time that the uptake of these early estimates, has been quite good, and it is shining a spotlight on where we are and the current state of play, and therefore putting questions in the current state of play about federal and provincial policy. There's a question in here about, what does this mean given where the federal government may or may not be going? We put this out as a record to say this is where we think things are going. Here's the history, and here's where we think they're going, and then it's up to folks to make their decisions and their trade-offs there. And of course, one of the big things we have in the country is this trade-off between more fossil development, right? We're endowed with all these fossil fuels, and then this climate crisis, right? So there's always this tension between the two, and depending on the government, their focus falls somewhere between the two, right? So, and our job is really to basically say, look, oil sands are really growing, and the policy is not really strong to reduce emissions there. So, if you want to reduce emissions and hit targets, or at least be on path for longer term targets and course correct, stuff needs to happen in this area. So we want to shine a spotlight on it. So maybe I'll stop there. See, do you have any follow up there? I mean, oil and gas, a third of our national emissions, right? I mean, it's growing share. What do you see in that trend?
No, I think what your explanation is right, Dave. I think it, clearly it's the elephant in the room. It needs our attention, it needs our full attention.
See, there's a question here about Scope 3 emissions, and this
Yeah.
leads into another data set Seton puts together, which is an amazing data set. Maybe I'll let you talk about the emission intensity data set, how Scope 3 factors into here, Scope 1, 2, and 3, and how
Yeah.
to think about it from an accounting perspective, because it's not always so clear.
Yeah, so I mean I think this question also addresses another question. But yeah, so this is scope one emissions, right? National Inventory Report. It's all direct emissions in Canada. But that's the thing, it's all emissions. There's nothing missing. You can then look at, what is upstream of another sector, but that those emissions are somebody's others direct emissions. So we're not missing anything in this national early estimate, right? All emissions are accounted for, except unless they're emissions from another country, right? So they're imported emissions from China or from North America through products or through energy. Um, uh, but we do what we have on the 440 website is we have an embodied emission intensity database, where you're able to look at emissions for different sectors in Canada, but also look at their scope 2 and scope 3 emissions, to give you a better picture of, for every dollar of output or every dollar of GDP in that sector, what the emission intensity is of scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, or total, altogether.
Yeah, so if you're trying to build a view of an industry or a facility's emissions that they're responsible for in the sort of in climate finance taxonomy world, right, where it's scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, you can use this database that Seton's put together to figure out what their scope 1 emissions are based on their sales or GDP, but typically their gross output or their sales. And then you can figure out their direct emissions, their indirect emissions, those imported into the facility through electricity or hydrogen or heat. And then you can look at their scope 3 supply chain emissions that they may or may not be responsible for, and then you can apply that. And so you can get a picture. I mean, that's really what that database is about. You have to be careful because as Seton said, you might be double counting nationally when you start rolling that all together. but he starts with this one view and then he carves it up by sector to see who's basically above and below them for emissions. And so that's a fun data set. There's another question here. There's a question sort of about there's strong alignment in these sectors who are emitting political high profile and those that most urgently need attention. In your view, which sector should governments prioritize for policy action? And see, I'll come in and let you in a sec. But at the Institute, we've identified for a number of years, obviously, oil and gas emissions are a priority. The methane regulations for conventional oil and gas have been delivering reductions. They're cheap. We see more reductions there. The pace has slowed in this inventory of reductions. Maybe you can talk about that in a sec. Slowed. So we would like to see the methane, and it's not that expensive, right? And frankly, a lot of it is just literally, hey, put duct tape, not quite, but this is my analogy. Hey, that thing's making a lot of noise, put duct tape over it. It's not quite that free, but it's close. So methane regulations matter. We think, of course, the EV availability standard is really important. We've seen, Seton's data shows major reductions there coming and higher penetration rates. And the fact that EV penetration is slowed is primarily a function of government policy. They're, at the current time, right? They slowed down their subsidy programs, federal and provincial subsidy programs. EV charging hasn't rolled out as fast, so it's a little harder. And so maybe not scrap that EV mandate, but slow the mandate down to better align with sales is something we think about. Is another one, and then the clean fuel standards, the clean electricity regulation. So electricity has been basically a bright spot, 60% reduction since '05. So continue on with electricity reductions. Saskatchewan just announcing they're going to build more coal, get back on coal-fired generation, really speaks to the need for the CER, clean electricity regulation, to exist. And frankly, it doesn't bite till 2035. So, there's a bunch of stuff there we've looked at, but and then buildings. Maybe I'll turn over to you, Seton. What do you think about buildings? We've talked about buildings a lot. They're tough to abate from. Lots of potential there, though.
Yeah, that's it. Like the question of what to prioritize, and the answer to get to net zero is everything. That's the easy answer. Um, there's a bit of like judging where we're on track and off track in terms of getting reductions from different sectors. So we're really worried about, the absolute number right now, but also the growth that we're expecting in these different sectors. And and then there are sectors where we've paid a lot of attention but haven't made a lot of progress. And there's sectors where we've not paid any attention or very little attention or less attention. I'm going to point out agricultural emissions, for example, where maybe there's a lot of cost benefit to emission reductions in the sector, and we just haven't tackled it because it's hard, right? It's hard to figure out what to do. So I'm of the opinion here that it's nice to have priorities, but nothing here gets a free pass. We have to look at everything. And I can name all sectors where we need to form policies. We need to address them.
Landfill waste, right? There's some regulations about strengthening national standard for landfill waste. Lots of methane coming into landfills. Not a lot of money around for municipalities to capture that methane and you capture and utilize it. And so, yeah, you can walk through every sector. But the big sectors, oil and gas, buildings, car and vehicles. I mean, that's really the merit order. And certainly with the buildings, it's not consistent or homogeneous. So, heavy duty trucks are slow to decarbonize, although biodiesel in BC from BC's low carbon fuel standard is starting to take off. And we see policy stacking going on there, which basically means if you go to biodiesel, you get a credit for your low carbon fuel standard. You get a credit for your clean fuel, right? Federal clean fuel regulation. low carbon fuel standard in BC. And if it's on site in your industrial facility, it helps you meet your large emitter requirement in British Columbia. And that's driving that sort of ecosystem of policy is driving a lot of penetration into biodiesel. And so we actually expect transportation emissions to look a little different going into the future in terms of the biofuel penetration. Now, of course, you can ask the question about, you're getting real reductions out of biofuels, and that's an open question. But I mean, we think there are reductions there, of course. So yeah, there's some interesting stuff to look at going forward. Seton, was there a sector that surprised you in this projection? The flatlining emissions. What we weren't expecting an increase. We were probably expecting a small decline.
Yeah.
What surprise? Anything surprise you in there?
Yeah, buildings a little bit, right? Buildings, I feel like we should be making more progress due to efficiency gains, right? Heat pumps and technologies, um, where, but the big thing that you measure in buildings is how much natural gas is being used for heating in Canada, and it it's only we're not seeing the gains that I would expect to see yet. Maybe it's just taking longer, right? Maybe we need another year or two for it to really bite. But that was one surprise for me.
Right. Right. I'm just trying to look at, yeah, I guess maybe moving on to the last question about projections and what do we see? Do we see lock-in of high emission sources in the country? I mean, one of the challenges with 2024, with a lot of the political uncertainty around policies and then now moving into a lot of geopolitical uncertainty, there is a tendency to slow investments down and not look to the long term. Expectations get eroded. And when expectations get eroded, you're not willing to basically look at the payback on a piece of equipment, whether it's your personal vehicle or whether it's a new boiler. And you're not gonna look at the horizon of your payback quite the same. And so what happens is when expectations get slowed, as in the EV available, EV sales with all the subsidies falling away, people are like, oh, I'm going to wait and see what happens. I'm not going to spend. If they do buy another car, you're locked in an ICE vehicle and a fossil vehicle. You're locked in for 10, 15 years in a car. Boilers are the same sort of thing. And so, buildings last for a long time and you switch the windows out once every 25 years. So, to the extent we don't set expectations with policy, it makes it harder later on to reduce emissions because we're locked into all this high emitting capital. And so the economic models really focus on that. They take a look at what you've done in the past, what you've deployed, and then it's really expensive to knock that stuff out. And of course, we see that in policy. And so that's one of the things we think about with locking in high emitting capital. And so if you are going to lock it in, make sure you have the safeguards, the emission safeguards and the regulations around it to make sure it's low emitting. So, the LNG in British Columbia, they're pushing for electrification of the compression stations, but you still have a lot of upstream emissions, a ton of upstream emissions. So those emissions should be covered by stricter methane regulations, for example, and best in class technology where you can get it. Otherwise, you're stuck with this stuff for 20 plus years. Steve, did you have any final thoughts on that sort of trend there? Or maybe some fun, maybe it's better. Let's give me a final thought. Give me just a quick overview of where you think emissions are going. And yeah, as a wrap up.
Yeah. Um, yes, lock-in. We see it all the time, all kinds of sectors. One of the big things that I worry about is simply investment, right? So we have a lot of heavy industry sectors, for example, that need new investment in plants and facilities, producing materials that we really need to drive our economy. Um, and it is, you know, it's where we are. It's hard to find capital dollars to invest, and then it's even harder to find capital dollars to invest in low carbon production. Um, and the climate we see it isn't conducive to making the investments to drive those emissions dramatically down, right? So if we build a new facility that's produces a tenth of the emissions of an old one, that's a great, that's what we want to do. That's what we want to see happen, but we see very little of it happening because there's just scarcity of capital and and uncertainty around will that investment make money.
Well, that's great, Seton. Well, thank you, folks, for sticking around. Big chunk of folks stuck around to the bitter end. I mean, Bill, there's a lot of talk about building right now, and one of the things we talk about at the Institute is building low carbon stuff, whether it's industrial stuff, whether it's more cars on the road, whether it's heat pumps, and that's durable. Like once you have something built, it's not a policy that can be repealed, and so that's really the challenge: is how do we build more low carbon stuff, and lock in, the good low emitting stuff into the future. So thank you all for your time. Appreciate it. From the Institute, thank you. And once again, thanks for our helpers who are amazing. And yeah, check out 440 Megatonnes on our website at the Canadian Climate Institute. Thanks, folks.